New on Curiosity Stream. How do you connect a 16th century potato to limitless energy production? Could Napoleon's toothpick have a direct link to a machine that predicts the future? And how can a 1700s conch shell chart a course to humans connecting their brains to the internet? James Burke's visionary series Connections returns for a new generation. Experience all new Connections. With monthly, annual, and bundled plans, find the one that works for you at curiositystream.com.
It's back! Hot barbecue sauce is back at Buffalo Wild Wings. That classic, smoky sweet barbecue with a spicy heat, a true fan favorite, has returned, and your wings are waiting. Come and taste the sweetness of heat. Hot barbecue sauce, back at Buffalo Wild Wings.
Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Join us as we seek the truth and travel the long road to justice.
Hey everybody, Fruit Loop here. Y'all know how much I love snow and I hate summer and hot weather. So this is for entertainment purposes only. My what you know for today is, did you know that you can walk from Russia to Alaska? So between Russia and Alaska lies the Bering Strait. When it freezes up in the winter, you can trek across. It's only about 2.3 miles, and that's at the shortest end. However, be great alibis and abide by the law. Don't try it. It's unsafe. The weather, the coldness, the wind, and also it's illegal, and you can be detained if you don't have the right paperwork to get in the country. So, just a little tidbit information. This is our last episode in our rebroadcasting series on the Pike County Massacre. I have thoroughly enjoyed interacting with you this week and sharing our prior coverage of this case. I encourage you to go back and watch or listen to all 6 episodes. The trial will be coming up in August. We hope you will follow us for that coverage. So sit back and take a listen.
So the co-defendants became upset and the co-defendants being Angela, Jake, and Billy, when they became upset when Jake's wife Elizabeth was called mom by Jake's daughter, who at the time, I think maybe she was 2 or 3. And they also monitored her social media, and they hired a private investigator to watch her while they were in Alaska. So in this filing, they also mentioned multiple instances of arson at various properties of the Wagners for financial gain, as well as theft by the family, such as shoplifting, stealing gas, tractors, and trailers. They talk about Billy Wagner, who's the dad, threatening the mom, Angela, with a gun. That would be his wife. Allegations that Billy Wagner had threatened to kill others before. The defendant's family involvement in transporting and engaging in drug trafficking, trying to obtain a mortgage by committing fraud. I had never heard that drug trafficking until now when it related to the Wagners. Now, we know the Rodens had some marijuana operations. It wasn't a big deal. It was probably enough to give them some extra cash, but
Yeah.
it wasn't like cartel style. Also, Billy and co-defendants threatening Chris Sr. with a gun within a week of his murder. Chris Sr. was the dad. And making threats to investigators who were working the case, making a plan to bust whoever was arrested for this out of jail. And they say that ultimately this family functioned as a unit the entire time. They didn't make any decisions without consulting each other.
Wow. It's just crazy.
It is crazy. These people are psychopaths.
Yeah. When you look at, and when you guys go back, and if you want to go back and listen to them.
Yeah.
When you listen to the breakdown we did of this case, it is just insane how they went from place to place, knew everything.
I mean, they stalked them. They knew who was coming home at what time, who was not there at what time. I mean, they jammed their trail cameras, if you remember. And like the one thing that when I think it's Bobby Joe Manley is one of the sisters, she was the one that found some of the bodies, and she said whoever did this, they had to know because those dogs would have eaten them up.
Yeah.
But like ultimately for a while she was under suspicion, and all she did was found the body. She went to the trailer with Frankie and Hannah Gilley, the one person that wasn't blood related. and their little boy came to the door. I think he was 3 or 4.
Yep.
And remember, she said it smelled like copper in the house, and he was covered in blood. And I think the little boy said something like, "Daddy's a zombie," or
Yep.
something to that effect. But for a while, she was under suspicion. It's just it.
Yeah.
And even if you've listened to it, I mean, like, go back, because we cover so much that sometimes you forget all these little crazy details. I'm going to be all over this trial. It's going to be streamed, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Really ready for this one. It's time too. This family's waited since 2016
Yeah.
for justice. All right, so we're going to jump into the Wagner hearing, because I'm going to tell you right now, this trial I am looking forward to, because this case is almost as intriguing to me as Vallow Daybell, in a different way, just because of the brazen murders that they committed all in one night. The family of 4: Billy Wagner, the dad; Angela Wagner, the mother; George Wagner, the fourth; and Jake Wagner, all arrested. Jake and his mother both have confessed. Jake confessed to 5 of the 8 murders, as well as a bunch of other charges. Angela essentially was the mastermind behind all this. She pled guilty and got 30 years in prison. The deal is, if Jake testifies to the satisfaction of the prosecution, then the death penalty will be removed for all 4 of the Wagners. Won't be for Angela, but I don't think she had death on the table, or maybe she did. So anyways, let's go through some of the new little nuggets we learned at this hearing. And it was held on Monday, and it was actually 6 years on April 22nd that these murders took place. And so again, when we say the long road to justice, a case like this, where you've had immediate family members who have passed away since the murders, never saw justice. It's been in and out of court, 2 years for them to get arrested, as you know. Right now, George the Fourth, his trial is tentatively scheduled to start August 29th. I don't think many people are confident that will actually happen, but we will see. So, out of the gate, the defense wants the jury to be instructed to take Jake and Angela's testimony with great caution. As you guys know, they are accused of killing 7 members of the Roden family, and Hannah Gilley, who was engaged to Frankie Roden, in one night. And they argued also for a change of venue, saying this is the biggest case really in the community, maybe even the state's history. And he said even the governor watched Jake plead guilty, and he said, when has that ever happened? He argued that a lot of information, especially what's on social media in groups, is wrong and could impact jury selection locally. And the prosecution said George didn't request a change of venue until January of this year, after Jake pled guilty. So the judge denied the request and said they're going to have it there. It looks like the prosecution is going to call about 308 witnesses. That's a lot. The state is using some informants, and some have been disclosed to the defense and some have not. The defense are saying that they do not have contact information of some of these informants, and the defense says they're entitled to any benefits informants may have received in cooperating with authorities. The defense also wants to interview Jake's ex-wife, Elizabeth. Now, she was from Alaska, so after the homicides, they moved to Alaska with the 2 minor children, and Jake got married to this woman named Elizabeth. The defense says they have not been provided with her contact information. So she is someone on that informant list, and she fled for her life when she left the Wagner home. And the prosecutor even tried to get her social security number changed for a new identity due to her fear of harm from the Wagners. And the prosecutor said giving her contact information could be risky for her life, but the defense has been provided a copy of her testimony. The Wagners accused George's girlfriend, Tabitha, of trying to poison them with food. They also tried to accuse Jake's Alaska wife, Elizabeth, of poisoning them with food. And the prosecutor said George is part of a criminal enterprise. They say they have conversations between George and Jake, and they acknowledge. Now, they wired this truck that Jake and George would drive cross country to make deliveries. And they acknowledged that they could be being recorded while they're going down the road, and that investigators might be listening to them. And they said they did mix things up in case that was the case, which it was. And the prosecutor said this family functioned as one unit to achieve their goals. Part of the control was over George's son and Jake and Hannah's daughter, Sophia, and also the child that wasn't his. The family was very insular. They shared finances. The boys were homeschooled. They would decide who had the best credit. They would get a house in that person's name. And in fact, they tried to get a house after the homicides, but they committed mortgage fraud in doing that by providing false information. And they said that all of their decisions, whether big or small, were made by taking family votes. They controlled Elizabeth, the Alaska wife, who moved back to Ohio with them, by the way, when they came back. They controlled even down to which room she would stay in when she was living with them, where they would live. And this is so weird, but Angela involved herself in George and Tabitha's intimate relations. And the same thing with Jake and Elizabeth, the Alaska wife. Nothing was off limits to the family to discuss, and everything was done as a unit. Not one of them went off and did their own thing. They talked a little bit about domestic violence towards Hannah when she was living with the Wagners, and Jake did admit to pushing her against a wall and having his arm in a position that choked her airway. And Hannah also expressed this in text messages to other people. And Jake was witnessed chasing her in a vehicle after they had an argument. So, moving on to intent and motive, Jake dictated everything regarding Hannah and their child, Sophia, which, for those of you that are new to the case, we have a whole bunch of episodes that we've done in the past with backstories on this family. So, please go catch up. It's an interesting case, and we will be all over this when it goes to trial. So, they say that the control started when Hannah was pregnant, and Jake demanded that his family care for Sophia if she was not with Hannah, and he wanted her to be homeschooled like him, and that Jake would make every decision regarding Sophia. And the control and those demands continued up until Hannah was murdered. His controlling behavior continued with Hannah's second child. Now, remember, this is not Jake's biological child. He demanded that Hannah not disclose the identity of the second child's actual father to him, and offered money for her to put his name on that child's birth certificate. And he was trying to convince her to move to Alaska and raise Hannah's new baby together as if it were Jake's. So there was a belief that Jake couldn't have children with anyone else because a new child might feel slighted. And when Hannah lived with the Wagners, they would limit her contact with her own family and would only let her reach out every so often. And she was allowed to call her mother on her birthday and Mother's Day. But towards the end, when Hannah moved out, there were instances of Jake's going to Hannah's house to do what prosecutors alleged to be scoping out a layout of that residence. One residence had been recently moved into. I do believe that was Dana Roden and little Chris. She had separated from Chris Sr. and moved to a trailer just down the road. I assume that's what they're talking about. And another residence was actually one that Jake had lived in, and he would ask them a lot of questions about locks on the doors. So during one of these scoping missions, George IV was waiting outside in the car. And when he got in the car, there were conversations about leaving quickly before other family members showed up and caught them. Jake was insanely jealous of Hannah's relationship with Charlie Gilley, who was the father of her new baby and also the brother of the non-rodent victim, Hannah Gilley. And at the panel for the Pike County Massacre podcast with Joseph Scott Morgan, they said that Hannah had, I believe, 5 shots to the face were her injuries, and they wondered, why would she get so many? And then they theorized, is it that connection that Hannah Gilley's brother was with Hannah and they had a child together? And it kind of makes sense. He wanted to get back together with her, and then he tried to get her to agree to shared custody of Sophia, which is reminiscent of what George IV did with the mother of his child, Tabitha. They made her sign a full custody agreement of their son over to George, with the agreement that Tabitha could visit the child only when the Wagners said she could, and only if the visitation was supervised by one of the Wagners. The prosecutor said ultimately she was rarely allowed to see her son. And Hannah Mae knew this. She knew what was going on. She was inboxing with Tabitha, and they were comparing horror stories essentially of the Wagner family. So in December 2015, conversations Hannah had with Tabitha's mother, who warned Hannah not to fall into the same pitfalls that Tabitha did. Hannah said the Wagners, as we know, would have to kill her before she signed over custody to them. And Jake acknowledged that when Angela read that message, that was when the motive for the murders were born. And there were conversations the night of the murders, just hours before Hannah was murdered, Hannah Mae, between Tabitha and Hannah Mae, where they recalled Tabitha's last day in the Wagner home. And Hannah was present for this. She was there where they had threatened to get a gun to use on Tabitha. And this is when she fled the house and hid in a barn until dark. And then she got on a bicycle and rode to a convenience store out of fear for her life. And Hannah told Tabitha she thought they would have killed her if she had not gotten away that night. And this all stems back to an argument over the minor child that Tabitha and George the Fourth shared. There was a very weird obsession with these grandkids, with Angela specifically. The prosecution said the Wagners had a unique playbook they would use when women would come into George and Jake's lives. And as we know, the Wagners spied on Hannah through her social media, and others had other people who lived nearby spy on Hannah when she had Sophia in her custody, seeing if there were any other men coming to the house. And if there were, they would report that to the Wagners. So Angela admitted she was the one who hacked the social media accounts. And the reason she said she was spying on Tabitha's social media is because she was starting to hear rumors that Tabitha was planning on taking the Wagners to court to get standard visitation with her son. So Angela would hack her Facebook to try and get damaging information against Tabitha to prevent her from getting any visitation rights at all. This is how they happened to see that communication with Tabitha's mother, and Hannah Mae. And 4 months later, after that message was seen, was when the murders took place. So Jake and Angela have admitted to a lot of stuff. And some of these things that we're talking about now have come from their admitting to the crimes. So Jake and Angela admitted part of the motive was to get custody of Sophia. And also they thought someone in Hannah's family or someone close to her may abuse Sophia, whether physically or sexually. And this was essentially, as far as we know, a very made up allegation, just something they created in their head to, I guess, make themselves feel better about being mass murderers. But Jake recorded conversations with Hannah prior to those murders. And there's also talk of how Angela wants to raise Jake and Hannah's baby as her own. And Jake actually gets mad at Hannah when she doesn't agree to this. And Hannah expresses how the Wagners want Sophia to refer to Angela as mother and not refer to Hannah Mae as mother. So it's the same theme that happened with Tabitha. It was almost the same argument as far as how this all played out. The prosecution says Hannah Mae was the intended target in these murders. Other acts relating to Tabitha, George IV's ex-girlfriend, they accused her of being physically abusive to her child. They accused her of trying to poison them with food. They also isolated her from her family. And they did get custody of the younger son under false pretenses. And how they did that was they told Hannah that the signing of custody was only temporary until she got a place of her own. Then they tried to avoid letting Hannah see the baby so that a year later they could claim abandonment and then she would never have legal rights to that child again. They also had people spying on Tabitha, and they would even get Hannah Mae to try to report to them anything Tabitha said about the Wagners or the baby. We learned that Jake once threatened to kill Hannah and told her body would never be found. So moving on to the Alaska wife of Jake, Elizabeth, she moved to Ohio with them and lived with Angela, Jake, George, and the two minor children. They had taken them after the murders. When they moved back to Ohio, Billy actually lived with his mother, Frederica. She was charged with some, I think it was obstruction of justice. I'm not exactly sure, but that went away. The same pattern with her, controlled her movements. On their wedding night, before the marriage was consummated, Jake demanded her passwords. On their wedding night, guys. I mean, it blows my mind. If I were her, as soon as he snoozed, I would have ran. They also put tracking devices on her phone. And they talked about this in the recorded conversations that investigators got. And they accused Elizabeth of being physically and sexually abusive with one of the children, also accused of trying to poison them with food. And she started to become suspicious because she had heard from the Wagners that Tabitha had allegedly done the same thing. And so at this point, Elizabeth became very concerned for her own well-being. So Jake and Angela confronted her in the kitchen. This is where they had family meetings, apparently. The prosecutor said most of the family meetings took place in the kitchen. And they had this meeting because Angela said the child claimed that Elizabeth had sexually abused them. Jake told her if he learned she had sexually abused the child, he would beat her with a bat. And if he didn't, his dad or his brother would. At one point in the conversation, the state has on record when they bugged the truck that Jake and George were driving cross country. Jake said Elizabeth could not tell her family where she lived, or he would have to kill them if they came around at this point, that now was not a good time. And I believe at this point, the investigation was really starting to heat up about the Wagners. It seemed like the Wagners knew they were onto them. And when Jake's child, Sophia, Jake and Hannah Mae's child, started referring to Elizabeth as mom, Angela and George were really upset with Jake for allowing the child to call her that. The concern was that George was afraid it would make his son question everything because his son was calling Angela mom, apparently. And this was apparently a big source of arguments between Jake, George, and Angela. These are recorded. This is why I cannot wait for trial if this stuff comes in. All this stuff essentially is prior bad acts that the prosecution wants to bring in, and the defense is arguing against it. They went through Elizabeth's personal items and found a notebook where she was writing down examples of their controlling nature and how they share finances. And she was frustrated that Jake's money was not his own. There were also conversations with Elizabeth about the time and manner of hers and Jake's sexual relations. So it seems like Angela would dictate where and when and how they would have sex, which is just, oh Lord, we're just going to skip that. We can all talk about how screwed up that is. They also hired a private investigator to trail her. The prosecutor said all this stuff is recorded. So George and Angela decide that Elizabeth has to go, and saying she is a danger to the family and to Sophia. And at one point, George says that he himself cares for Sophia more than Jake does. And he said, I thought everything we did was for Sophia's benefit, which I assume is the murders. He said Jake treats Sophia like a second-class citizen. And he said that Jake would hug Elizabeth, his wife, before he would hug Sophia. And at one point, they thought she was a BCI agent. So they thought his wife was, they're very paranoid. And I guess they would be at this point. It's pretty clear investigators are hot on their trail. Ultimately, they have a family meeting. And guess what? They decide, you guys got to break up. Jake did not want to break up with her, but ultimately, I guess it's a majority rules family, and he did. The prosecutor also said they have high levels of proof the Wagners were suspected in several arsons of various properties for financial gain. Everyone in the conspiracy had their own rule, and they carried out their own rule. Angela puts herself away from the crime itself, and the prosecutor said they all have a cover-up story that they had concocted. She cites case law of claims of innocence but presence, which means George is saying, yes, I was there. No, I didn't shoot anybody. And she said because he claims this, it opens the door to allow these prior bad acts to be entered into the trial. They also say Jake was preparing to teach Sophia in the way of the family and how he was raised and raised her that way. The prosecutor gave the example of how the boys were taught to steal gas from trucks, saying this was a family affair. So she really was alluding to the fact that they must have on conversation that Jake intended to raise Sophia as he was raised. There were a few prior acts she said they would not pursue due to lack of evidence. She didn't say what they were. So this is interesting. I didn't know this. On the night of the homicides, they set up a fake drug deal to give them access to Chris Sr. So this allowed Billy to drive up to the residence that night. And the prosecutor said this drug deal was very lucrative. So we knew that Chris likely was alive when he was murdered, based on some of the forensic evidence. And I'm sure we'll learn more about that. But now it makes sense. He didn't just bust up in there and catch him awake. He was invited over because under this fake drug deal that would have been very good. Jake and George were there, but they hid in a truck that they had bought and modified specifically for this murder, and they called it the murder truck. They stayed in there not to be seen, and we really don't know what happens after that. They had other people commit perjury and obstruction of justice. They were heard talking on the wire to others in the family and extended family. I believe her mother, Billy's mother, Frederica. And they have information from Jake that Angela said she bought the shoes for Jake and George, and Jake admitted they wore them the night of the homicide. Just recently, they ruled this shoe print evidence could come in. She's on surveillance at Walmart buying the shoes, and I believe there is a receipt they found for that. They had witnesses who were going to do them a favor and testify the shoes were not bought for that purpose. But with the admission, it kind of makes they might not want to get up there and perjure themselves. At this point, the judge interrupts the prosecutor and asks if the visit from Billy Wagner was expected by Chris Sr. the night of the homicide. And then she recounts the fake drug deal. Jake and George were hidden, as we know, but the judge seemed a little baffled to me about that. It was, minutes later, and it kind of popped back in his head, and then he addressed it. So how with the fake drug deal, the story that Billy was giving investigators after the murders, obviously when he's being questioned, he named somebody who he said probably murdered Chris Sr. for cutting him out of this fake drug deal. That was the story or the theory that he tried to use to take a little heat off of him and his family. They asked Rita Newcomb, which is Angela's mother, to lie to the grand jury and investigators about notarizing those custody papers. If you remember, they forged Hannah Mae's name. Jake and George were the ones who came up with the idea, according to Angela. And this was in case the boys were killed or arrested on the night of the murders. They have recordings where the boys told others not to talk to investigators and also encouraged them to ignore subpoenas. They hired attorneys for witnesses and accompanied them to the lawyer's office and kept doing this kind of influential stuff after their arrest. She didn't elaborate. Don't know if it was jailhouse calls, emails, or what. But she did say that a lot of the violence, the threats of violence, came from George towards the sheriff and law enforcement. They have that on audio. Elizabeth Wagner would testify that she heard them say if some of them were arrested and not others, they had plans of how they would bust the ones that were incarcerated out of jail. All four defendants, I said dependents, they are co-defendants, so it's not wrong, how they all four participated in those conversations. So there was a family vote of whether to commit the murders, and everyone said yes. The judge asked for clarification that an actual vote took place and also asked again about the escape plan, if some were arrested but not all. She confirmed that the vote happened and they also had plans in place to bust somebody out. George paid for the vehicle that was bought specifically and used the night of the murders, and they called it the murder truck. They did this so nobody would recognize them. And the judge asked if it would be better to have people come testify to these bad acts as opposed to having, I guess, transcripts. And the prosecutor said Jake and Angela will testify to this. Seems like maybe the judge was a little bit worried that this could be prejudicial to the jury in some ways. He did not rule on this stuff. I'm keeping an eye out, but that's it.
Hey guys, thanks for listening. I've enjoyed bringing you this case this week of our rebroadcasted series. Please join us when this trial starts. We will have coverage of this whole thing. It's a crazy case, so stay tuned. We will be back Monday with a new episode.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Lucky Land Casino, asking people, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
Lucky? In line at the deli, I guess?
Aha, in my dentist's office. More than once, actually.
Do I have to say?
Yes, you do.
In the car before my kids' PTA meeting.
Really?
Yes.
Excuse me, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
I never win and tell.
Well, there you have it. You can get lucky anywhere, playing at LuckyLandSlots.com. Play for free right now. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.